So today I'm delving into another old classic sci-fi novel and its review. The novel is Transit by Edmund Cooper. Edmund Cooper is one of the early science fiction greats in the English tradition rather than the American. And Transit is one of the first science fiction books that I started acquiring for myself. I bought this at a second-hand bookshop when I can't have been more than 12. I read it, I adored it. It's been travelling around the world with me ever since. This very copy has probably better travelled than about 50% of Australians. And I've been rereading it. After all these years, I recognise that I am completely and utterly incapable of being impartial about this book. While I'm reading it, I'm reading the words and I'm reading the story, but I'm also remembering the feelings of reading it for all these years. It's a comfort book. You go back to it when you want to be reassured that the world is the way you think it is, which of course it isn't. But yeah, anyway. So, Transit was one of the first books I read with people taken out of place and put on another planet. And Edmund Cooper is a somewhat controversial, I suppose, author. He's an old school author. He is. Some of his books can be pretty harsh in a lot of ways. This one should contain a content warning in that later on in the book there's rape and it's not very nice. It's not very graphic either, but it's not nice. I actually found it fairly traumatizing at the time. But it starts off with Richard Avery, and I actually got really excited about this a few years later when I found another secondhand book in another secondhand bookshop, which was science fiction written by Richard Avery. And I eventually realised, all on my own, thank you very much, that Edmund Cooper had a number of pseudonyms that he wrote under. Anyway, back to this Richard Avery. I'm going to read a couple of sections from it. I found the writing spectacularly beautiful. I still find it quite lovely. And, but like I said, there's no impartiality in me at all about this book. At 35, Richard Avery was a failure. Not an amateur failure, a professional failure. He had made a pretty good job of it. 15 years ago, he had been all set to be an artist, not necessarily a good painter, but at least one who slapped colour on the canvas as if he really meant it. And this is introducing Richard Avery early on, and this is on page 2 actually, and it's talking about how he's has had the flu, he's walking around Kensington Gardens, he's depressed, he's been mildly suicidal for a long time, and in the post-influenza depression he's hoping that he might be depressed enough to actually do it. So far he's been a failure at that as well. We have a few paragraphs about why his life has failed and why he's miserable. And then talks about where he is right now. So he settled down to a vista of years without purpose, to a life teaching art to children whose conception of the human form had been modified by cinema posters and deodorant advertisements, whose gods lived mysteriously in black discs, repeating parrot cries of anguish at the stimulus of a needle, and whose maturing values could be expressed in terms of paychecks, fast cars, drugged orgasms, and the ultimate hypnosis of suburbia. Whew, heady stuff. So I loved the writing style. I loved the dark, somewhat grim depression of those early pages, but there aren't too many of them, so you don't have a lot of time to get depressed. Next thing you know, comes the scenes where Avery is incarcerated on what may or may not be a spaceship. It's never that explicit about it, but it reads like a spaceship to someone who had already read a lot of science fiction. He looked for the door. There was no door. He looked for a bell push. There was no bell push. He looked for escape. There was no escape. Da 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 da. And shortly after this, we encounter a character that I adored. I didn't lack for female characters so much in the literature that I read, but I liked strong female characters. I didn't mind not having any female characters in the books I read, but when I got a female character, I wanted to have something to enjoy, respect, some strength, some sass. I didn't have a lot of sass at that age. I got it later. So here is our first meeting of Barbara Mills. She was blonde and in her mid-20s. At least, thought Avery, she looked as if she might be in her mid-20s, for she had the sort of vaguely attractive and subtly ageless face that might belong to a mature teenager or a youngish woman of 40, and I liked that description. Barbara Mills was, back in real life, an actress playing a nurse in an endless hospital series that Richard Avery used to try actively to not see, and which Barbara Mills herself despised. I enjoyed every part of Barbara. I enjoyed how vibrant a character she was. I liked everything about her. I don't think anyone who knows him or anything about him could claim for a second that Edmund Cooper was a feminist writer. He was anything but. His views on women were a little bit naff, and I was much happier before I knew what they were. Confirming me in my early teenage Deb never read about the authors, and she never read the introductions, and she wasn't interested in any of that. She wanted the story. And I think I gained a lot by that with the early science fiction. Most of the authors weren't people I particularly wanted to respect. It was all about the story. Edmund Cooper's one of those. So even though I found Barbara Mills to be an excellent, strong, vibrant character, there's a place a little bit further on where she and Avery are deciding how to react to the people who are capturing them aboard the ship. They're discussing what their two options are, and he says, "You don't want to be emancipated about it?" And she replies, "I don't want to be emancipated about anything. I can usually get what I want without resorting to equal votes." No feminist is going to like that, let's be honest. Let's also be aware that this was written in 1964. So attitudes were different. The 60s was a very alien social culture to our own, almost one can say. But despite that, Barbara Mills was my favourite character in this. I didn't mind Avery. He was the stereotypical male leader that Edmund Cooper has in every single book of his that I've read so far. I love the scenario though. So I'm going to read you another section from the part where they wake up on a tropical island. And living as I was, kilometres and kilometres from the ocean, in a mountain area that got very cold in winter and was never all that pleasant for me, I'm an ocean-going creature, the fact that they woke up on a tropical island and the rest of the book occurs on a tropical island was marvellous. We start off in Kensington Gardens, then we go on a possible spaceship, then we're on a tropical island for the rest. It's like all my Christmases come at once. And here we go. There are 4 people that have been dumped on the shore with a whole heap of gear. And the 2 guys wake up first. Tom, this is where we meet Tom for the first time, and Tom shoots Avery a warning glance. Then he grinned cheerily at Barbara, who's just woken up, and says, "Glad you feel able to join the party at last. I was just pointing out to Richard that in all probability we have been dumped somewhere in the South Pacific." Barbara yawned and shook her head. "Grow up, lover boy. Richard is right. We're elsewhere." Avery raised an eyebrow, which prompted me to learn how to raise an eyebrow. I just remembered that Richard Avery is the reason I cultivated that skill. So having raised his eyebrow, he says, "How long have you been awake?" "Long enough. A girl likes to know what kind of party she's joining before becoming an active member." She stood up, stretched, and then peered at Mary. "The sleeping beauty is still out. Our youth, our carefree youth." "You're both crazy," persisted Tom. "They haven't even been able to send a man to Mars yet, so I don't see how they could pop this little expedition down somewhere in the deep blue yonder." "They?" echoed Barbara. "Who do you mean by they?" "Boffins, the space swallows." And how much does that say about the character right there? "My dear, dear Tom," said Barbara sweetly, "do me a small favour and stop talking like something out of the book of the film. Incidentally, I know something you don't. Try looking over your shoulder, in the sky, a little higher, now a little to the left. He stared for a moment or two, then became aware of the faint silvery crescent, high, remote, almost lost in the blueness. The moon, said Tom finally. So what? The moon in daytime is a perfectly normal phenomenon. See it a lot in summer. In the South Pacific, the seasons and daylight appearance will be reversed, that's all. Perhaps, said Barbara. Now look low over that bunch of palm trees. Tom looked, and so did Avery. There was a long silence. And that, of course, was the second moon. I love this book. In terms of early science fiction, I think the skillfulness in the language was unique among the authors I already had. Edmund Cooper and Harry Harrison were two of the early authors that I acquired for myself. I inherited Theodore Sturgeon and Robert Heinlein and Asimov from my parents and a few other ones, but Edmund Cooper and Harry Harrison were my own finds. And yeah, love this book. One of the early science fiction ones that will, for me, never grow old.